Hey everybody. So today we're going to talk about chapter 3. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Make sure I got the right one. All right. Again, I'm not going to go through the questions on here because you guys know what the big questions are going to be, and those are really good ways for you to go into the slides and figure out if you read the chapter thoroughly or if there's something that you are missing. So I urge you to go back to those and then also do the review questions kind of at the end of the slide in your head just to make sure that you're getting it before you take the quiz, because that will aid you in making sure that you get the grade that you want. Okay, so we're going to talk about socialization. We're also going to talk about the life course, and we're going to talk about aging through a sociological lens. Socialization is really a process where we as social entities or humans in a society learn how to be a human in that society, right? So like you're going to learn the rules of what things look like. You're going to learn the values. You're going to learn how to be who you want to be, kind of, and the rules in which are going that will limit you in being that. But it'll also talk about we're also going to talk about how those socialization processes get reinforced and or get broken down through social change and or just time, space, and what have you changes the processes for even how you garner materials. So the socialization for how we dress, for example, has changed dramatically over time and space, right? Because we have access to more materials and more rapid pacing of distributing those materials. For clothing, it's not your grandmother sitting at home with the cotton threads and making your shirt. It's not the knitting the skirt. It's not having to rely on being able to get those materials from far away or what have you. There's a process to which this. Also, we change our dress depending on what season it is, right? So if somebody came out in I don't know, let's say tennis shoes, a tank top, and surf gear in the middle of a snowstorm, those are going to still break those social norms, right? Those socialization process is going to say like, hey, wait a minute, that's not what you're supposed to be doing, and we're going to give you this negative feedback to show you that you're not living up to whatever those social norms and values are. And it can be something, and we'll get into kind of how that happens here in a minute, but we're going to really talk about how socialization, the products, the institutions, how socialization is done in society. And we're also going to talk about particularly how it changes over the course of your life. So social reproduction also is the process of perpetuating those values norms, which can lead to structural continuity over time. So basically what that's saying is that when we're reproducing these social norms, when we're reiterating them over and over and over again in society, essentially that's forming their solidness and also creating a community that tends to look, act, and think similarly. Socialization is not, again, limited to childhood. And we experience socialization through a wide variety of entities. This slide particularly is going to talk about resocialization, or where we learn new rules depending when we enter a new social world. So say we go from middle school to high school, right? Those are different social worlds. And so you're going to get re-socialized on how these new rules work. Say you go to high school to college, those things are going to change too, right? You're going to have a re-socialization because you have to learn the rules and normatives for that new social environment, right? And that happens over and over again. It happens every time you change jobs. It happens every time you, to an extent, make a new set of friends, or you move to a certain new place, or you become part of a different agency or group or social circle, right? Like any of these things are going to create a re-socialization that may be different from the socialization you got, say, as a kid with your parents or in your family setting, or even in maybe some of your school settings previously or what have you. And then there's a desocialization, which is the process where you unlearn rules and norms upon exiting a particular social world. And again, that's just so when you're making any kind of transition in your life, you're going to change the way you act, and you're going to leave behind some of those social rules, right? So when you like, and I keep using school because that's just the one that keeps popping in my head, but say you go from one job to the next, right? You're going to forget some of maybe the social norms of how you would interact with a customer with this. Like say you answer the phone a specific way. And that's going to be a social norm that is created by that institution, by that workplace. But you're not going to answer the phone the same way if you're at a new company, and that particular thing has to be desocialized from your brain to create a new norm, essentially, to answer the phone the way that particular job maybe wants. And so, like, and it's hard sometimes to do that, which is why sometimes we end up accidentally answering the phone. Like you're at work and you answer the phone the same way you're at home and you answer the phone the same way you would at work, right? These things are different, but you're exiting that social place and entering your home. And so that's not the same place as work, but you're still going to answer the phone accidentally that way sometimes because your brain just gets into like go mode. It just does, right? Because that's the socialization you've been taught and it's been reinforced over and over and over and over again. So we're going to talk about theories of child development for a minute. Mead talked about how we learn to use the concept of I and me. And it really talks mostly about how I is a singular thing and me becomes a part of a group, right? I am denoting myself as part of a group. And Charles Cooley demonstrates the importance of other individuals for shaping a child's sense of self. So you're going to learn how to be yourself essentially by watching those around you, by interacting with those around you, by learning how to imitate those around you to an extent. Because we all kind of do that, especially when we're little. We imitate the people around us that are caring for us, right? We imitate how they act. We want to put on their shoes and pretend to be them when they're going to work or what have you. But that's just kind of part of learning how to be a human. So again, the next one's really focused on cognition, which is that human thought process involving perception, reasoning, and remembering. And that cognition process, when that starts to be developmentally appropriate, really allows us to understand or perceive ourselves within our own environment. And that includes our social environment and includes, it's not just learning not to touch hot things or those kind of things like, hey, I'm interacting with this environment and it's giving me a negative feedback, but it's also learning how to, hey, I'm watching mom get ready for work or whatever, and maybe she's putting on lipstick or what have you, and I'm learning how she's doing that. And maybe at some point I'll imitate that or what have you. And I want to put on my own makeup, right? Because that's what I see happening. And that's just a really short example, but like, it's just perceiving yourself again in your own social environment and learning how to be yourself. And that is very much reinforced or shut down depending on all the different statuses you impact and the people that are around you and their norms and values. Again, according to Mead, infants and young children develop as social beings by imitating the actions which we just talked about, right? He believed that self-awareness was the ability to distinguish me from the I through the process of play he called taking the role of the other. So really understanding that I can pretend to be somebody else, like when I'm playing fireman or when I'm playing school teacher to my stuffed animals or when I'm playing pro football star or what have you with my friends, or I'm, like there's a way to take on the role of maybe somebody else that you idolize or somebody else that you see in society, but then also realizing that then I step out of that role and still I am me and I'm not that person at this point. And that's what they're talking about with kids, is kids try on a whole bunch of different personalities. They try on a whole different types of people in order to kind of figure out what fits and figure out what is them. The social self, which is the self-consciousness in human individuals, according to Mead, is the identity conferred upon an individual by the reactions of others. And we're going to talk about those reactions here in a minute. Self-consciousness, again, is the awareness of others distinct social identity as a person separate from other people. We're not born with this, but we acquire an awareness of self as a result of early child socialization. The learning of language is of vital importance in this process because they learn the differences between essentially talking from self or talking about others, and all of those tenses and pretenses that we use within our language help to distinguish humans from each other. Mead also believed a further stage in child development occurred between 8 and 9 when they learn to play organized games, which have rules that reflect other social values. So when you're playing, say, a board game with somebody, you're going to learn that cheating gets you a negative consequence. You're going to learn that you can't just make up a new rule to allow you to win, or you can't, you know what I mean? Like there's particular ways this game is played. And if I don't do that, that's going to come with negative consequences to me. And if I do that and I win, then I've realized that I've learned how to play the game, if that makes sense. And the generalized other is this concept, again, by Mead, which the individual comes to understand the general values of a given group or society during the socialization process. So they're going to essentially say, okay, this is me, and I have to act like this generalized other being. And we're going to talk about that generalized other being probably in other chapters as we start talking about what the ideal is in any particular given status. And again, we'll get to that at a much further chapter, but it's good to kind of remember this idea of there's this image we have of one particular thing. When we think of school teacher, we're going to have this image. When we think of say a baseball player, there's a particular one that probably pops in your mind. When you think of maybe even a criminal, there's going to be an image that pops in your mind. And we have to kind of think about and analyze what that generalization does and how it impacts our biases and understandings of the world, which we'll again get into more as we move through the course. So don't worry about if that kind of if that felt like a lot. So we're going to get into Cooley and the looking glass self. This is a super important idea in sociology, and it's essentially that the reactions we elicit in social situations create a mirror in which we see ourselves. So in other words, if people treat us consistently with this particular image of whatever identity we have, we internalize that, and we can essentially start to believe it ourselves too. So if somebody, say a teacher, consistently calls on you and tells you that you're really, really smart and that you've got this and you're doing great, right? You're going to an extent, internalize that and be like, hey, I'm good at this thing. That's not to say that you didn't believe that before, but when you get those consistent reaffirmations of a particular idea, good or bad, it starts to become part of the way we look at ourselves. And that's part of socialization, right? Is consistently getting specific kinds of feedback for specific kinds of actions that we do. Those reactions cue us into good, bad, or otherwise how our actions are being perceived by others. Okay, modern refinements of the series suggest that individuals take action to bring others around to their own views of themselves rather than passively accepting. So we're not, again, this is just talking about the fact that we don't always accept, especially the negative assumptions of us, right? So if we have, per se, like a queer identity, and that queerness, say, is looked upon as ugly or gross or not okay in particular social settings, there is a very good chance that that person's not going to necessarily change their sexuality or their gender depending on what this other person thinks about that particular identity, right? They're going to do some pushback. And we as humans, especially to the identities that we hold the most value in, will consistently push back to those negative reactions that we will see from socialization, from the socialization process. And then we tend to also find groups in where those negative reactions don't necessarily occur, or try to change those negative reactions in groups that we have to be in. say family, say religious institutions, say job environments such as that. All right. So we're talking about this particular idea is really just talking about when cognition again develops, children's awareness of his or her environment is dominated by perception and touch. So children, especially at a young age, before they have a lot of language, before they have a lot of information about the world, their environment is directly what they see, what they can interact with, and what they specifically can interact with in a way of touching, in a way of understanding the physical components. And that's because as a child develops, they really have to understand and perceive their environment based on what they have to see developmentally, to see and perceive their environment. They don't have language, they're not going to be able to use that to perceive their environment. And the main accomplishment of this stage of childhood is really understanding that the environment has distinct and stable properties. And that's really talking about, hey, the ground's always going to be underneath me, right? Like I realize that I can walk on this or I can crawl on this and it's going to be there. Now, I also realize that if I decide I'm going to crawl up to the pavement and there's a curb and I look down and I touch down, hey, that's down. Like I'm going to fall if I keep doing this, if I keep going this direction. And those kind of things they can count on, right? They can count on if I come up to a ledge or a curb or what have you, it's going to have that property of stepping down, or it's going to have that property of falling down. And there's also this in the social world, right? So, hey, if I decide I'm going to do this particular action, say an infant is crawling and keeps trying to get into something like a plug, an outlet, right? I'm going to understand that I'm always going to have an adult that continues to take me away from this particular thing and tells me no, or tells me that's dangerous, right? And so I'm going to cue in my head, hey, this thing is something they're not going to let me do. I'm not allowed to do. And that is stable, right? This is a stable thing that is going to consistently be there. And that's really just talking about how the physical and social world have these distinct and stable properties for kids, and that to learn them, they have to do that through, again, touch, interaction, because those are the cognitive functions that they currently have at that stage. Then you have the pre-operational stage, which is really just talking about the child has an advanced, has been able to master essentially basic models of logical thought. So they're very egocentric. So essentially, they're really thinking about at that point in life, how does this interaction or how does this particular thing impact me? Right? Because at this stage, they're really trying to figure out how they interact with the world, how the world interacts with them. And in doing that, they have to be able to say, okay, logically, when I do this, it's going to get this reaction. Or logically, when I go and again, now I realize that there's electricity in the outlet and that electricity could shock me. I don't want to do this anymore because this is now, I can now logically think of the reasons why this is not okay, right? Using that same example that we previously used. And when they talk about egocentric, they're just talking about really thinking that involves an understanding of objects and event solely for one's own position. So they're not thinking about how possibly say a whole group of friends get together and they're maybe playing together at a play date, right? And we see this often in young kids, right? And somebody picks up a toy that somebody else wants to play with. That second kid that didn't get the toy is not going to see how that first kid really wanted to play with it. They're only going to see how they wanted to play with it. And that's a really important distinction, is that they can understand how they might play with that toy, but they're going to see the situation almost always in the, well, but what do I get out of this? Or, well, but how does this get me to the goal that I had? And that's something that kids have to learn. There are the perceptions of others. They have to learn a situation from others' point of view, and they're not as good at that at this stage. And then you have concrete operational stage, which is really just when children's thinking is based on physical perception of the world. In this phase, the children is not yet capable of dealing with highly abstract concepts or theoretical situations, or hypothetical is what it said, sorry. But really, so we get into this stage, and again, this is when kids get in that stage where everything's black and white, right? Like there is no gray area. So you made a rule or you said something, it's going to have to go through all of it. There's not going to be that ability. They lack that ability to be like, well, wait a minute, there's exceptions. Why, what are these exceptions? Why are they there? You said this. And I'll give you an example. So one of my kiddos is in this particular stage of development right now. And so they were learning the English, they're learning the grammar rules and English. And so there's an exception for some of those grammar rules, right? Like you put an S to make something plural, but when there's already an S, you got to add an ES, which makes sense, except for sometimes in names, you still add that even though that there's not an S. And there's like all these different rules. And they're like, but wait a minute, what I learned previously was this rule. And that previous rule is still in their head. It's concrete, right? It's hard for them to work around that to get to the, yeah, but okay, but in this case, that's not the case. And that's a particular language degree, but we, again, a language example, but we do that within our social world as well. And it's really just, hey, you said no to this all the time, but you just let my younger sister do this. What does that mean? Well, it means that your younger sister was doing this in a completely different context than when you asked me to do it, right? But they only see, but you said no to that, so you should say no to this, right? Because to them, the situation doesn't look socially different because, again, they're thinking in a very concrete way, if that makes sense. Whoa. And then there's the formal operational stage, which is really just when growing children becomes capable of handling abstract concepts and hypothetical situations. So that's when you can start talking about them. So, hey, you want to do this thing, but this thing might bring on this consequence. Are you okay with this consequence? Should you still do this? Or maybe if you don't do this, you get this particular consequence and it might be positive. So maybe if we don't do this, you'll see what you want to see or you'll get to your goal. And you can really look at them and reason with the different options and how those options essentially would impact them. Whereas before, they're not going to necessarily pull those up, or they're not going to necessarily care about the hypothetical positive or negative consequences. They want to do the thing they want to do, right? And they want everything that they do to have the same consequence, period. There's not going to be any flux, if that makes sense. But they talk about, I also like that in this, they also talk about that all the first three stages of development are all universal. They happen for everybody, but not all adults reach the ability to the formal operational stage. And that's just because there's a lot of different ways in which people think, and not everybody can get to these abstract concepts, these hypothetical situations, especially if they're really big and they're talking about, say, we start talking about how race operates in the United States, right? There's going to be a lot of concepts in there that you have to really think outside yourself. You have to really start working with and listening to different people from different backgrounds that don't look like you. And that's for everybody, right? Because we can't carry every single identity into a situation and every single understanding of how that situation will play out differently for other people unless we get to this stage and we're really thinking about abstract concepts. And really this gets down to, again, critical thinking. And how do we apply an analysis to a situation that allows us to ask questions and allows us to really form perceptions that are not of just ourselves and our own way we think about the world. Okay. So I'm going to stop here and then I will get back in here and finish this out because I want to get into the agents of social change and the institutions and kind of how that changes as we grow. And that's going to be another lecture. So I will be right back with that. I hope you guys have a great week. And I hope that all of this makes sense. And as always, please do not hesitate to reach out if you have questions, comments, or concerns. All right. Have a good day.